The wrapped box sat between them like a chasm, its simple brown paper entwined somehow magnifying every cruel word Marina had ever spoken to Daniel. She picked it up with 2 fingers, as if it might contaminate her manicured hands, and the laugh that escaped her lips was sharp enough to shatter glass. Everyone in the office break room fell silent, their Christmas party chatter dying as they watched the scene unfold. Daniel stood there, his worn janitor's uniform a stark contrast to her designer dress, his weathered hands trembling slightly as she held his offering like it was garbage. What she didn't know was that inside that humble package lay something that would strip away every layer of her carefully constructed superiority and reveal a truth so devastating, so beautifully heartbreaking, that it would change the trajectory of her entire life. Marina had always been the golden child of Brennan's Securities. At 32, she'd clawed her way to senior executive, her corner office overlooking the city a testament to her ruthless ambition. She wore her success like armor, each designer label, an expensive accessory a shield against the poverty she'd escaped in her childhood. But somewhere along the way that armor had become her prison, and she'd forgotten what it felt like to see people as anything more than obstacles or stepping stones. Daniel was just the janitor, invisible to most, a ghost who cleaned up after everyone went home. She'd never learned his last name, never acknowledged his quiet good mornings, never noticed the way he carefully tended to the office plants, or how he always made sure her workspace was immaculate before she arrived each day. If you believe in the power of kindness and second chances, and in stories that remind us of our shared humanity, please take a moment to like this video, leave a comment sharing your thoughts, and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us bring more meaningful stories to life, stories that might just change someone's perspective when they need it most. The Christmas party had been Marina's idea, a corporate obligation she'd organized with mechanical efficiency. She'd spent thousands on catering, decorations, and an open bar, all while cutting corners on the year, in bonuses for the support staff. When Daniel had approached her with that small box, she'd been holding court with the other executives, champagne flute in hand, basking in their admiration. His interruption had been poorly timed, his nervous smile grating against her polished presentation. The box looked homemade, pathetic really, and when he'd stammered something about wanting to thank her for something she couldn't even remember doing, her instinct had been to dismiss him entirely. But something made her take it, perhaps the watching eyes of her colleagues, perhaps some buried instinct for public relations. And then she'd laughed, that brittle, cutting sound that she'd perfected over years of boardroom battles. The weight of collective judgment pressed against her as she stood there, the box still dangling from her fingers. Someone coughed uncomfortably. Sarah from accounting looked away. Even her closest ally, James, seemed to study his shoes with sudden intensity. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating, and Marina felt the first crack in her armor, a whisper of something that might have been shame. Daniel's face had gone pale, but there was no anger in his eyes, only a deep sadness that seemed ancient and knowing. He nodded once, slowly, and turned to leave, his shoulders curved inward as if protecting something fragile. And it was in that moment, watching him walk away, that Marina felt something shift inside her, some long, dormant instinct stirring to life. Her hands moved almost without conscious thought, peeling back the brown paper with suddenly clumsy fingers. The room remained frozen, everyone pretending not to watch while watching intently. Inside the paper was a simple cardboard box, and inside that, nestled in tissue paper, was a photograph in a small wooden frame. Marina's breath caught in her throat. The image was old, the colors faded with time, showing a young girl, maybe 7 or 8 years old, standing outside a rundown apartment building. The girl was thin, wearing clothes that didn't quite fit, but her smile was radiant, genuine, full of hope. It took Marina several heartbeats to recognize herself. Beneath the photograph was a folded piece of paper, the handwriting shaky but careful. Marina's hands trembled as she unfolded it, her eyes scanning words that seemed to reach back through time and grab hold of her heart. Daniel wrote that 30 years ago, he'd been a different person, struggling with addiction, living on the streets near her childhood neighborhood. One winter morning, when he'd been at his absolute lowest, contemplating whether life was worth continuing, a little girl had approached him. She'd been clutching a paper bag containing half a sandwich and an apple, her school lunch, and she'd offered it to him with a smile that suggested she saw him not as a homeless addict, but as a human being who mattered. That little girl had told him that her mother always said everyone deserves kindness, and that things could get better if you just held on. The letter explained that he'd never forgotten her face. That memory, The way her simple act of compassion had given him a reason to seek help, to fight through rehabilitation, to rebuild his life one painful day at a time. He'd been clean for 28 years now, had reconnected with his estranged daughter, had found peace in the quiet dignity of honest work. When Marina had been hired at Brennan Securities 3 years ago, he'd recognized her immediately, saw that same face from his memory now grown and hardened, transformed by time and ambition. He'd watched her from the shadows, this woman who'd once been that compassionate child, and he'd wanted to thank her, to remind her of who she'd been before the world had taught her to build walls. The photograph, he explained, he'd carried with him for 3 decades. After that morning, he'd gone back to that street corner day after day, hoping to see her again, to thank her properly. One day, he'd found this photograph lying in a puddle near her apartment building, clearly dropped and lost. He'd kept it all these years, a talisman, a reminder that kindness existed, that he'd been worthy of it once, that redemption was possible. He'd had the frame made specifically for her, had waited for the right moment to return this piece of her past, to show her the ripple effect of a single generous act. Marina's vision blurred as tears she hadn't cried in years spilled down her cheeks, ruining her carefully applied makeup. She remembered that morning now, remembered her mother's words about kindness, remembered the man's surprised face, the way he'd thanked her with a voice rough from D'Souza. She remembered being that girl who believed the world could be better, who saw people's humanity before their circumstances. And she realized with crushing clarity how far she'd drifted from that child, how she'd let ambition and fear transform her into someone who would mock a man's heartfelt gratitude, who would laugh at genuine kindness. The break room remained silent as Marina clutched the frame to her chest, her shoulders shaking with the force of emotions she'd suppressed for so long. She'd spent years climbing, achieving, succeeding, and somewhere along the way, she'd forgotten the most important lesson her mother had taught her. She'd forgotten that every person carries their own struggles, their own stories, their own inherent worth that has nothing to do with job titles or bank accounts. She'd forgotten that the smallest acts of kindness can echo through decades, can literally save lives, can change the entire course of someone's existence. Marina set down her champagne glass and walked through the silent crowd, her heels clicking against the floor with a rhythm that sounded like a heartbeat, like a countdown, like a second chance approaching. She found Daniel in the hallway, standing by the janitor's closet, his back to her. When she said his name, her voice was raw, stripped of its usual authority and polish. He turned slowly and she saw no judgment in his face, only that same deep sadness mixed now with something that might have been hope. She apologized, the words inadequate but genuine, flowing from a place she'd locked away for too long. She apologized for laughing, for her cruelty, for all the times she'd walked past him without seeing him, for becoming the kind of person who would mock someone's gift instead of recognizing the profound love and gratitude it represented. And then she thanked him, not just for the photograph and the reminder of who she'd once been, but for never giving up, for choosing life that morning 30 years ago, for becoming someone who could stand in front of her now, as living proof that people can change, that redemption is real, that the best versions of ourselves are always worth fighting for. If this story has touched your heart, if it's reminded you to see the people around you, to recognize the power of your own kindness, please leave a comment below, sharing how you plan to carry this message forward. Your words might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today. Daniel smiled then, a real smile that reached his eyes, and he told her that she'd never really changed, not at the core, that the girl who'd shared her lunch was still there, just buried under layers of protection and pain. He said sometimes we all need someone to hold up a mirror, to show us who we really are beneath the masks we wear. As they stood there in that hallway, two souls connected across decades by a single act of compassion, Marina felt something fundamental shift inside her. The armor she'd worn for so long began to crack and fall away, and underneath, she found not weakness but strength of a different kind, the kind that comes from vulnerability, from remembering our shared humanity, from choosing connection over isolation. When Marina returned to the party, she did so with Daniel beside her, introducing him properly to her colleagues, sharing his story with his permission, letting them see him not as the janitor, but as a man, as someone's father, as a person who'd overcome impossible odds, as the living embodiment of why their work, their success, their lives should never make them forget the most important things. The photograph sat on her desk for the rest of her career, a reminder of who she'd been and who she'd chosen to become again. And every morning, when Daniel greeted her with his quiet good morning, She responded with genuine warmth, seeing not a janitor, but the man who'd given her back the most precious gift anyone had ever offered, the chance to remember her own heart.